At 56, Helen Brooks lost almost everything. Her marriage was over. The house was gone. Most of her savings disappeared in the divorce. Everyone expected her to move into a small apartment and quietly start over. Instead, Helen made a decision that no one could understand. She spent every dollar she had left to buy a forgotten 65-acre farm that had been abandoned for more than 30 years. The barns were falling apart. The fields were dry. There was no electricity, no working well. People in town laughed the day she signed the papers. Some called her foolish. Others said loneliness had finally clouded her judgment. For nearly a year, Helen worked alone, following a handful of strange handwritten notes she had found hidden inside the old farmhouse. Then, exactly 1 year later, the entire town gathered outside her property because the land everyone believed was dead had suddenly come back to life. And buried beneath those 65 forgotten acres was a secret no one had discovered in decades. Before we begin today's story, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What city or country are you in? And what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below so I can say hello to our wonderful Storytime family around the world. If you're starting your morning, I hope you have a peaceful and beautiful day ahead. And if you're listening tonight before bed, I hope this story brings you comfort, hope, and a little inspiration. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about second chances, forgotten legacies, family, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's go back to the day Helen Brooks bought the one farm that everyone else had already given up on. Helen Brooks folded the final page of the divorce papers and placed them back inside the envelope without reading them again. There was nothing left to change. After 32 years of marriage, the signatures had divided everything that once felt permanent. The house she had raised her son in now belonged to someone else. Most of her savings had disappeared in legal fees and settlements. What remained fit inside the trunk of her aging station wagon and a single checking account that looked smaller every time she opened it. At 56, she found herself starting over in a way she had never imagined. Her son Liam met her outside the attorney's office. He hugged her tightly before loading the last box into the car. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "You can stay with me until you figure things out." Helen smiled gratefully. "I know." Liam looked at her with concern. "Then promise me you won't rush into anything." She nodded, though she wasn't certain she could keep that promise. For weeks, she had been searching online listings for small homes she could afford, but every option felt less like a beginning and more like surrender. That afternoon, while driving through the countryside simply to clear her mind, she noticed a weathered real estate sign leaning beside an overgrown gravel road. 65 acres, estate sale. Curiosity led her down the narrow lane. Tall weeds brushed against both sides of the car as she drove toward a farmhouse barely visible beyond rows of neglected trees. The roof sagged. Windows were clouded with dust. An old red barn leaned slightly to one side, surrounded by rusted fencing nearly hidden beneath vines. The fields stretched toward distant hills, covered not with crops, but waist-high grass and scattered brush. Everything about the place suggested it had been forgotten for decades. Yet Helen couldn't explain why she felt reluctant to leave. The realtor arrived a few minutes later in a pickup truck. He introduced himself as Mark and apologized before they even began walking. "I should warn you," he said. "Most people don't stay more than 10 minutes." Helen looked across the quiet property. "How long has it been empty?" 32 years. He kicked lightly at a loose stone on the porch. Owner passed away. No children. The estate sat in probate longer than anyone expected. They stepped inside the farmhouse. Dust covered nearly every surface, but the structure itself remained surprisingly solid. Sunlight spilled through tall windows onto worn wooden floors that only needed care instead of replacement. The fireplace still stood proudly in the center of the living room. Helen walked slowly from room to room. She could almost imagine laughter echoing through the empty halls many years earlier. "Nobody wants this place," she asked. Mark shook his head. "Too much work. The soil's considered poor. The wells barely produce. People say the land's worn out." Helen stepped onto the back porch overlooking the fields. A warm breeze carried the scent of wild grass instead of fresh crops. Somehow it didn't feel lifeless. It felt quiet, as if it had simply been waiting. 2 days later, Helen returned to sign the purchase papers. She emptied nearly everything left in her account to buy the property. Mark looked at her over the contract with genuine concern. "You still have time to change your mind." Helen smiled gently. "I've already lost the life I planned. Maybe it's time to try one I never expected." When the final document was signed, Mark handed her the keys with a puzzled expression. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for out there." Word spread quickly through the nearby town. By the time Helen drove onto the property with her belongings, several pickup trucks had slowed along the road. Among them was Richard Doyle, owner of the largest farm in the valley. He leaned comfortably against his truck, while 2 neighboring farmers stood beside him. "You really bought this place?" Richard asked. Helen nodded. He looked across the abandoned fields and chuckled. "You know the soil won't grow much of anything," one of the other men added. "Most folks would have paid someone to haul this place away." Richard smiled, not cruelly but with quiet certainty. "If you decide to sell after a few months, let me know. I'll give you a fair price." Helen thanked him politely and carried another box toward the porch. The laughter behind her wasn't loud, but she heard it all the same. She spent the rest of the afternoon opening windows, sweeping away years of dust, and clearing enough space in the kitchen to prepare a simple meal. The work was exhausting, yet strangely peaceful. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, she walked to the edge of one neglected field. The grass moved gently in the evening breeze, hiding whatever lay beneath. An elderly man approached slowly along the fence, carrying a wooden cane. "You must be Helen," he said with a warm smile. "Arthur Collins. I live over the next hill." Helen introduced herself. Arthur studied the land for several moments before speaking again. "Most people think this farm died a long time ago." Helen looked across the quiet acres. "Did it?" Arthur smiled faintly. "The man who owned this place used to tell me something every spring. He rested both hands on his cane. He'd say, 'Give the land 1 full year, and it'll tell you the truth all by itself.'" Helen woke before sunrise to the unfamiliar silence of the farmhouse. There were no passing cars, no neighbors mowing their lawns, only birds calling from the distant trees and the gentle creaking of old wood settling after a cool night. She wrapped a sweater around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. Mist drifted across the abandoned fields, softening the rough edges of broken fences and leaning sheds. For the first time in months, she felt something she had not expected. Peace. The farmhouse needed far more work than she could finish in a single day. The kitchen sink leaked steadily. Half the windows refused to open. The electricity worked only in a few rooms, and the old water pump groaned every time she turned on a faucet. Still, she spent the morning cleaning one room after another, opening curtains, sweeping away years of dust, and carrying broken furniture onto the porch. By afternoon, the little house no longer looked abandoned. It simply looked tired. As she paused to catch her breath, her phone rang. Liam's name appeared on the screen. How's the castle? He joked gently. Helen laughed for the first time in days.
It's more of a museum at the moment.
Mom, his voice became more serious. You can still change your mind. She looked out the kitchen window toward the wide fields. I know. You spent almost everything buying this place. I know. If it doesn't work, Helen interrupted softly, then at least I'll know I tried. There was a long pause before Liam sighed. I still think you're the bravest, stubborn person I've ever known. I'll take that as a compliment. After the call ended, Helen climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The room smelled of dry wood and old paper. Most of the furniture had been removed years ago, leaving only a few shelves, several empty crates, and a heavy oak trunk tucked beneath the highest window. The trunk contained blankets, faded photographs, and several family quilts carefully folded together. Beneath them lay a small leather notebook covered in dust. There was no name on the cover. Curious, Helen opened the first page. Instead of personal letters or family memories, she found neat handwritten notes describing different sections of the property: soil conditions, rainfall, planting dates, small sketches of hills and fields. Every page carried careful observations rather than stories. Interesting, she whispered. She sat on the attic floor reading for nearly half an hour. The entries mentioned allowing certain grasses to grow instead of removing them. Others suggested leaving fallen leaves in specific areas or digging shallow channels along old fence rows. None of the notes explained why. They simply recorded instructions as though the writer assumed the reasons would already be understood. Helen tucked the notebook into her pocket before climbing downstairs. That evening, Arthur Collins stopped by, carrying a basket filled with fresh vegetables from his own garden. Thought you might appreciate a proper supper, he said warmly. Helen thanked him and invited him onto the porch. As they watched the sun settle behind the hills, she showed him the notebook. Arthur carefully adjusted his glasses before reading several pages. A quiet smile crossed his face. I haven't seen this handwriting in over 30 years. Helen looked at him. You recognize it? Arthur nodded. It belonged to Samuel Whitaker. He owned this farm until he passed away. Helen glanced at the worn pages. Did he really write all these notes? Every one. Arthur closed the notebook gently. Samuel watched this land the way some people watched the weather. He noticed things most of us never bothered to see. Helen turned another page. But none of this explains what he was trying to do. Arthur smiled thoughtfully. No. Samuel rarely explained anything completely. Before Helen could ask another question, Arthur stood and looked toward the distant fields. He always believed the land would teach patient people more than impatient ones. The notebook remained in Helen's hands long after Arthur left. That night, she copied several pages into a fresh notebook of her own. She did not fully understand the instructions, but something about their careful detail convinced her they had been written with purpose. The following morning, local radio stations began interrupting regular programming with agricultural updates. Weather experts warned that rainfall across the region had dropped well below average during the winter. If spring storms failed to arrive, the coming summer could become the driest the valley had experienced in decades. Farmers were encouraged to prepare for possible water shortages. Helen switched off the radio and looked through the kitchen window at the quiet 65 acres stretching beyond the farmhouse. Then she opened Samuel Whitaker's notebook once more. The next page began with a single sentence written more heavily than the rest. Everything depends on keeping the ground alive, before the dry season begins.
Helen read Samuel Whitaker's notebook again over breakfast,
Stopping often to compare its sketches with the view outside her kitchen window. The instructions remained surprisingly simple. Leave fallen leaves beneath the trees. Never clear the grass completely from the hillsides. Reopen shallow drainage paths instead of digging new ones. Plant ground cover before turning the soil. None of it resembled modern farming advice she had seen online. Yet every page reflected years of careful observation rather than guesswork. She closed the notebook and quietly said to herself, "If this worked for him, it's worth trying." She began with the smallest task. Instead of cutting every inch of the tall grass around the farmhouse, she mowed only narrow walking paths, leaving the rest untouched, just as the notebook suggested. She gathered fallen branches into low piles beneath the old oak trees instead of burning them. Along the edge of the largest field, she noticed a shallow depression almost hidden beneath weeds. Following another sketch from the notebook, she spent most of the afternoon clearing it with a shovel. It slowly revealed what looked like an old drainage ditch, nearly filled after years of neglect. Helen worked until her back ached. She wasn't trying to transform the entire farm in a day. She simply followed one instruction at a time. A week passed that way. Every morning she chose another page from Samuel's notebook. Some tasks seemed almost too ordinary to matter. Others left her wondering if she had misunderstood the writer completely. Yet little by little, the property began looking cared for instead of abandoned. Liam visited the following weekend carrying groceries and a toolbox. He stopped beside the reopened ditch and looked across the uncut sections of grass. "Mom?" he asked carefully. "Why are you leaving half the field untouched?" Helen smiled and handed him the notebook. Liam read a few pages before shaking his head. "This goes against everything people usually do." "I know. And you're following it anyway?" Helen nodded. "Whoever wrote this watched this land for decades. I think they've earned a little trust." Liam looked around the quiet property. "I still don't understand it." "Neither do I," she laughed softly. "Maybe that's why I'm curious." Together they repaired loose porch steps, replaced broken window screens, and patched part of the barn roof before Liam drove home Sunday evening. As he pulled away, he looked back once more at the overgrown fields. They still seemed impossible to him, but his mother's determination had begun replacing his worry with quiet respect. News of Helen's unusual methods spread quickly through the valley. Richard Doyle stopped along the roadside one afternoon while checking fences nearby. He climbed out of his truck and leaned against the gate, studying the property. "You're letting weeds take over," he called. Helen walked over, wiping dirt from her hands. "I'm following a plan." Richard smiled politely.
Looks more like you're avoiding work.
Helen laughed instead of arguing. "Maybe we'll both know who's right eventually." Richard shook his hand. "You bought 65 acres. You should be planting every inch." He looked across the untouched grass. "Land doesn't make money by waiting." "Maybe not," Helen replied. "But maybe it needs time before it grows anything worth keeping." Richard chuckled and wished her luck before driving away. His words lingered in the air long after the truck disappeared. Helen wondered briefly whether he might be right. Then she remembered Samuel's notebook and returned to clearing another old drainage line hidden beneath blackberry vines. Several days later, Emma Doyle arrived unexpectedly. Unlike her father, she didn't laugh. She introduced herself politely before asking if she could walk part of the property. "Dad says you're farming backwards," she admitted with a smile. "I'm actually curious." Helen handed her the notebook. Emma read silently while standing beneath the shade of an old maple tree.
Occasionally, she glanced toward different sections of the land, comparing the sketches with what she saw.
"These notes are unusual," she finally said. "Whoever wrote them understood natural soil recovery surprisingly well." Helen looked relieved. "So I'm not completely crazy?" Emma laughed. "No, just very patient." Before leaving, Emma paused near the largest pasture. "One question," she said. "Have you noticed those wooden posts?" Helen followed her gaze. Scattered across the field, almost hidden among the tall grass, stood weathered stakes rising only a few inches above the ground. She had passed them many times without thinking much about them. "I assumed they were old fence posts." Emma slowly shook her hand. "They're spaced too evenly." After Emma left, Helen carried the notebook out into the field. One by one, she found more of the old stakes. Some leaned slightly, others were almost buried beneath grass. As the afternoon sun lowered, she stepped back far enough to see them together. They did not mark old fences. They seemed to form a deliberate pattern stretching across the 65 acres. Helen opened Samuel Whitaker's notebook once more. Tucked loosely between two pages, she discovered a small folded scrap of paper she had never noticed before. It contained only a rough, hand-drawn sketch showing several identical wooden stakes connected by faint lines running beneath the ground. Helen carried the small sketch with her everywhere the next morning. She compared the faded drawing to the weathered wooden stakes scattered across the property, stopping at each one to study its position. The more she looked, the less they resembled forgotten fence posts. They followed gentle curves across the hills instead of straight property lines, almost as though they had been placed to trace something hidden beneath the surface. By midday, she had marked every visible stake on a fresh sheet of paper. The pattern matched Samuel Whitaker's sketch almost perfectly. Arthur Collins arrived just as Helen was finishing. He leaned on his cane while studying the map she had drawn. "You found the markers," he said quietly. Helen looked up. "You knew they were here." Arthur smiled. "I knew Samuel placed them. I never knew exactly why." Helen showed him the folded sketch from the notebook. Arthur adjusted his glasses and looked at it for a long moment. "He carried something like this in his pocket for years." "Did he ever explain it?" Arthur slowly shook his hand. "No." Samuel believed people learned better by seeing than by being told. Together they walked from stake to stake through the tall grass. Arthur occasionally stopped, remembering small details from decades earlier. "I used to see him out here after heavy rain," he said. "He'd stand perfectly still for several minutes before moving another marker a few feet." Helen frowned. He was measuring something. Maybe. Water always seemed important to him. They reached the old drainage ditch Helen had reopened the week before. To her surprise, one of the wooden stakes stood directly beside it. Another lay farther downhill, following the sketch. Helen cleared weeds between them with a rake. Beneath the grass, a shallow depression slowly appeared, curving gently across the hillside. It was almost invisible until the weeds were removed. Arthur smiled softly. "There's another one." Encouraged, Helen continued clearing the line. The depression stretched much farther than she expected, joining the ditch she had already restored before disappearing beneath another field. It did not look like erosion. Its edges were too smooth and consistent. By late afternoon, Emma Doyle drove onto the property carrying a soil probe and a notebook. "I couldn't stop thinking about those markers," she admitted. Helen led her across the field and showed her the newly uncovered depression. Emma knelt and examined the soil carefully before pushing the probe into the ground. It slid in with surprising ease. She tested several more spots along the same line. "Interesting," she murmured. "The soil here holds much more moisture than the surrounding ground." Helen looked surprised. "Even after all these dry weeks?" Emma nodded. "Something has been guiding water through here for a very long time." They followed the depression farther until it reached another stake hidden beneath wildflowers. Emma smiled as she studied the landscape. "This wasn't created by chance." Helen unfolded Samuel's sketch once more. Faint lines connected the markers in graceful curves, almost like veins spreading beneath the land. Emma compared the drawing to the hills around them. Whoever designed this understood how water naturally wants to move. Arthur listened quietly before speaking. Samuel never called himself an expert. Emma looked around the property. He didn't have to. Over the next several days, Helen and Emma carefully cleared more of the old pathways shown on the sketch. Some were little more than shallow swales covered by decades of grass. Others had nearly disappeared beneath brush. None required digging. They simply needed to be uncovered again. Helen noticed that after a light spring rain, water lingered inside these gentle channels instead of rushing downhill and disappearing. The land seemed to absorb it slowly. Even Richard Doyle paused one afternoon while driving past. He climbed out of his truck and watched Helen working with Emma. "What's all this?" he asked. Emma answered before Helen could. "We're uncovering old water pathways." Richard looked skeptical. "Looks like ditches to me." Emma smiled politely. "Not exactly," Richard shrugged. "Well, if digging little trenches makes you happy." He tipped his hat and drove away. Helen laughed softly after he disappeared. "He still thinks I've lost my mind." Arthur smiled. "Samuel heard the same thing for years." That evening, Helen returned to the attic, hoping Samuel's notebook might explain more. She carefully turned each page again, paying closer attention to the small sketches than the written notes. Near the back, she noticed 2 pages stuck tightly together. Gently separating them revealed a folded sheet of heavy paper hidden inside the binding. She unfolded it slowly across the attic floor. It was an old hand-drawn map of the entire 65 acres. Every wooden marker, every restored drainage path, and every natural waterway appeared in careful detail. Across the bottom, written in Samuel Whitaker's neat handwriting, were 5 quiet words. "The land remembers every drop." Helen spread Samuel Whitaker's map across the old kitchen table before sunrise, weighing the corners down with 4 coffee mugs so the brittle paper would not curl. Unlike the smaller sketches in the notebook, this map showed the entire 65 acres in remarkable detail. Gentle lines curved across hillsides, circled clusters of trees, and connected every wooden marker she had discovered. Small handwritten notes appeared beside many of the lines. "Do not straighten. Leave shaded. Protect native grasses." None of the instructions focused on producing larger harvests. Every one centered on protecting the land itself. Emma arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying graph paper and several aerial photographs of the valley. She carefully laid them beside Samuel's map. "Let's compare them," she suggested, as they matched landmarks, fence rows, and hills. The old map aligned almost perfectly with the modern images. Emma traced one of the curved routes with her finger. "These aren't random drainage paths." Helen nodded. "What are they?" Emma looked thoughtful. "They're designed to slow rainwater instead of letting it rush downhill. The water spreads, sinks into the soil, and stays underground much longer." Arthur joined them later that morning. When he saw the old map, he smiled with quiet recognition. Samuel kept that rolled up inside a leather tube whenever he walked the property. Helen pointed toward the notes written along the edges.
Did he ever tell you why he worked so hard? Arthur lowered himself into a chair.
Years ago, he tried explaining it at a town meeting. Helen looked up. Arthur continued. Most folks wanted bigger irrigation pumps and deeper wells. Samuel kept talking about healthy soil instead. Emma smiled faintly. He was decades ahead of his time. Arthur nodded. People laughed. They said grass and leaves couldn't solve drought. Helen looked through the notebook again.
So he kept working anyway.
Arthur's expression softened. That's who he was. The next several weeks became a steady rhythm of quiet labor. Helen followed the map one section at a time. She reopened shallow swales hidden beneath years of weeds, spread fallen leaves beneath old trees instead of burning them, and planted simple ground cover wherever bare soil appeared. None of the work looked impressive from the road. In fact, the property appeared even wilder than before. Yet Emma noticed small changes almost immediately. Earthworms returned to places where the soil had once been hard. Moisture remained beneath the surface days after light rain. Wildflowers began appearing along restored drainage paths. One afternoon, Richard Doyle stopped again while passing the farm. He leaned against the fence, watching Helen spread mulch around a grove of young saplings. "Still not planting crops?" he asked. Helen smiled. "Not yet." Richard shook his hand. "You can't make a living growing weeds." Emma stepped out of the barn carrying the map. "She's growing healthy soil." Richard laughed politely. "Healthy soil doesn't pay the bills." After he drove away, Helen looked toward Emma. "Sometimes I wonder if he's right." Emma folded the map carefully. "Maybe in the short term." She looked across the rolling fields. But whoever designed this wasn't thinking about one season. Helen smiled. "Neither am I." That evening, Liam visited again. This time he noticed changes the moment he stepped out of his truck. The farm still looked rough, but it no longer felt abandoned. Walking paths wound naturally between fields. The porch had fresh paint. Wild birds gathered near the restored swales, and patches of green remained where neighboring fields had already begun drying. "You've been busy," he said. Helen laughed. "I've had good teachers." She showed him Samuel's notebook and the large map. Liam studied both quietly. "This man really believed every part of the land worked together." "I think that's exactly what he believed." Liam looked toward the hills. "I'm beginning to understand why you stayed." Helen felt a quiet warmth hearing those words. For the first time since buying the property, she no longer felt she needed to defend her decision. She simply continued the work. One afternoon, while comparing the map with the notebook again, Helen noticed something she had overlooked. In the lower corner of the map, one section of the property had been carefully outlined with darker ink. A single handwritten sentence appeared beside it. "Final restoration unfinished." She searched the notebook for the same phrase and eventually found a matching entry. Samuel had written only a few lines. "Everything else prepares the land. The final section completes it." No explanation followed, only a small hand-drawn symbol that looked like a cluster of fruit trees. Helen carried the map outside and walked to the marked location. The area lay beyond an overgrown hedgerow she had not yet cleared because thick blackberry vines blocked the way. Standing there, she noticed several unusually straight tree trunks hidden beneath the tangled growth. They did not resemble wild forest. They looked as though someone had planted them long ago in careful rows. Helen unfolded the map once more. The darker outline ended precisely where the neglected grove began. At the very bottom of Samuel Whitaker's handwritten notes, beneath decades of observations about soil and rain,
One final sentence waited in smaller lettering than the rest. The work is not finished until the center lives again. The words stayed with Helen long after she left the overgrown hedgerow. The work is not finished until the center lives again. She carried Samuel Whitaker's map back to the farmhouse and placed it beside the notebook on the kitchen table, then spent the evening searching every page for more clues about the marked section. At first, she found only familiar entries about soil cover, shade, and water movement. Then, near the back of the notebook, she noticed a group of pages written in smaller, tighter handwriting than the rest. They had been dated during Samuel's final years on the farm. The first sentence made her sit very still. "If I do not live long enough to complete the center garden, someone patient must finish it for me." Helen read the passage twice, then a third time. Samuel described the center of the property as the heart of the restoration, the place where all the slow water paths, shaded soil, native grasses, and tree lines were meant to meet. He wrote that healthy land needed more than water. It needed roots, pollinators, shelter, and time. The final section, he explained, had been planted once but never fully revived after years of drought and neglect. Helen looked out the dark kitchen window toward the hidden grove beyond the blackberry vines. She no longer saw it as another patch of overgrowth. She saw unfinished work. The next morning, Emma arrived with pruning tools, gloves, and a serious expression. Helen handed her the notebook without speaking. Emma read the pages while standing beside the porch rail. "A central garden," she said quietly. "That explains the symbol on the map." "Do you think it's still there?" Helen asked. Emma looked toward the hedgerow. "Only one way to find out." Arthur joined them shortly afterward, moving carefully with his cane across the uneven ground. When Helen mentioned the center garden, his face changed with recognition. "Samuel used to call it the living heart," he said. "I thought he meant it poetically." They worked together through the morning, cutting back blackberry vines slowly enough to avoid damaging anything beneath them. Liam arrived after lunch and took over the heaviest clearing, relieved to have a practical job instead of another argument to offer. "This is more dangerous than it looks," he said, pulling thorns from his sleeve. Helen smiled. So was starting over. He gave her a tired grin and kept working. By late afternoon, the first clear opening appeared in the thicket. Beyond the vines stood several old fruit trees, their branches tangled and dry at the tips but still alive near the trunks. Emma pressed her palm against one of them and looked upward. "Apple," she said. She moved to another. "Pear. Maybe plum over there." Arthur stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wet. "He planted them for the bees," he whispered. Helen turned to him. "You remember?" Arthur nodded slowly. "He said an orchard could feed more than people if it was planted right." The grove was badly neglected, but it had not died. Beneath the weeds were stone borders forming curved beds around each tree. Narrow swales guided water toward the roots. Fallen leaves had gathered in natural basins, slowly turning into dark, rich soil unlike the hard earth in other parts of the farm. Emma knelt and crumbled a handful between her fingers. "Helen, this soil is alive." Those words carried more weight than any compliment. For months, Helen had been following instructions she barely understood, trusting notes written by a man she had never met. Now the land itself seemed to answer. They spent several days clearing the grove carefully. Samuel's final instructions guided every step. "Do not strip the ground bare. Cut only dead wood. Leave flowering weeds where bees gather. Reopen the small water paths by hand." Helen followed each line as if reading a letter meant specifically for her. Sometimes she grew tired enough to question whether she had the strength to finish what Samuel had begun. Then Liam would bring another wheelbarrow of mulch. Emma would point out another sign of recovery, or Arthur would share one small memory, and Helen would keep going. One evening, after the worst of the vines had been cleared, Helen sat alone beneath the oldest apple tree and opened the notebook again. The final pages were not instructions, but reflections. Samuel had written about dry years that would become drier, wells that would struggle, and towns that would eventually regret treating land as something to exhaust rather than care for. He had not sounded angry. He sounded patient, even hopeful. "If the center lives," one entry read, "the rest of the farm will remember how to hold water, shade, seed, and life." Helen touched the trunk beside her. She understood now that Samuel had not been trying to create a pretty orchard. He had been building a living system, one quiet layer at a time. At the bottom of the last written page, a short note had been underlined. "When the trees bloom again, ask the county to measure the soil." Helen read it aloud the next morning to Emma, who looked up sharply. "He wanted proof," Emma said. Helen nodded. "Not for himself, for the land." As they prepared to leave the grove, Arthur noticed a flat stone almost buried near the center. Liam helped lift away the soil around it until a weathered inscription appeared. It was not a name or a date. It was a simple carved phrase. "The heart is here." The carved stone changed the way everyone looked at the grove. Until then, Helen had thought of it as the last neglected section of Samuel Whitaker's plan. Now it felt like the center of everything he had tried to protect. The words, "the heart is here," rested in the soil beneath the oldest apple tree, worn by time but still readable, as if waiting for someone patient enough to uncover them. Over the next several weeks, Helen, Emma, Liam, and Arthur returned to the hidden orchard almost every day. They pruned dead branches carefully, cleared only the most damaging vines, and reopened the small water paths Samuel had drawn on the map. Emma insisted they move slowly. "If we strip everything at once, we could hurt what survived," she explained. Helen understood. The entire farm had been teaching her the same lesson since the day she arrived. Recovery could not be forced. It had to be invited. Spring deepened around them. The surrounding valley grew drier than usual, just as the weather reports had warned. Richard Doyle's fields began showing pale patches along the ridges, and other farmers talked nervously about irrigation costs at the feed store. Yet inside Helen's orchard, small green buds appeared along branches everyone had assumed were dying. Emma noticed first. She touched one gently with the tip of her finger and smiled. "This tree is waking up." Helen stood beneath the old apple tree, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if hope itself might be startled away. "After all these years," Emma nodded. "The roots stayed alive." Arthur sat on a nearby stump, watching the moment with tears in his eyes. "Samuel would have stood right there," he said softly, pointing toward the stone marker. "He always believed this place would come back if someone gave it enough care." Liam looked across the grove, where bees had begun visiting tiny wildflowers along the restored swales. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think you found what you were supposed to find." Helen turned to him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. For months he had worried that she had thrown away her future on a hopeless piece of land. Now he stood in the middle of that same land, holding pruning shears, looking at it with respect. That meant more to her than she could say.
A few days later, Richard drove up while Emma was testing soil near the orchard.
He walked across the field more slowly than usual, his eyes moving from the green swales to the budding trees. "Emma says the soil here is different," he said. Helen wiped her hands on her work pants. "That's what Samuel believed." Richard looked uncomfortable. "I thought he was wasting time all those years."
Arthur leaned on his cane.
"Most people did." Richard walked to the edge of the grove and looked at the old fruit trees. "My father used to say Whitaker cared more about worms and weeds than crops." Emma knelt beside a soil sample. "Maybe he understood that without worms and roots, there wouldn't be crops for long." Richard said nothing. For once, he did not laugh. Over the next month, the hidden orchard continued changing. Blossoms appeared first on the pear trees, then the old apples, then 2 plum trees near the center that Emma had almost given up on. Their flowers were not perfect or abundant, but against the dry valley they looked miraculous. Birds returned to the hedgerow. Bees gathered in quiet clouds above the flowering weeds Helen had nearly cut down before reading Samuel's instructions. The ground beneath the trees remained soft and dark, even after several rainless weeks. Emma brought measuring tools one morning and compared the orchard soil to samples from nearby fields. The difference was visible before she even finished. "This holds moisture nearly twice as long," she said, astonished. "And the organic matter is far higher than it should be after this many years of neglect." Helen looked at the orchard as sunlight moved through the blossoms. "So Samuel was right." Emma smiled. "More right than anyone knew." Word spread again, but this time the laughter faded. A few neighbors asked to see the orchard, then a few more came. Some stood awkwardly at the edge, unsure how to admit they had dismissed the farm too quickly. Helen welcomed them anyway. She showed them the swales, the old stakes, the map, and the carved stone. She never claimed to understand everything. She only explained what Samuel had written and what the land had begun showing them. By early summer,
Emma contacted the county agricultural office.
"They should measure this officially," she told Helen. "Samuel asked for proof when the trees bloomed again. I think it's time." Helen agreed, though the thought of officials walking the property made her nervous. She still felt like a beginner following someone else's notes. Liam squeezed her shoulder. "You brought it this far. Let them see it." The county inspectors arrived on a dry, windy morning. They carried soil probes, clipboards, cameras, and moisture meters. Richard came too, standing quietly beside Arthur while the officials tested the orchard, the restored swales, and several fields across the property. The lead inspector looked increasingly puzzled as the readings came in. "This land should not be retaining this much moisture," he said. Emma pointed toward Samuel's old map. "Unless it was designed to." Helen watched as the inspector studied the map, then the green orchard, then the dry hills beyond the fence. His expression shifted from skepticism to something close to awe. Finally, he turned back toward the driveway, where 2 more county vehicles were pulling in with additional survey equipment. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "we need to take a closer look at this entire farm." The additional county vehicles carried specialists from the regional agricultural office as well as survey equipment Helen had only seen in magazines. They spread across the 65 acres in small teams, taking soil samples, measuring water infiltration, and comparing moisture levels between Helen's land and neighboring properties. Emma moved with them, answering questions about the restored swales, the hidden orchard, and Samuel Whitaker's notebook. Helen stayed mostly quiet. She knew every path across the farm now, but she still felt that she was simply continuing another person's work, rather than claiming it as her own. By late afternoon, The inspectors gathered beneath the shade of the oldest apple tree. The lead soil scientist held a clipboard filled with numbers and looked across the green fields surrounding the orchard. "I've never seen neglected farmland recover this quickly without heavy irrigation," he admitted. Emma smiled. "It wasn't neglected. It was waiting." The scientist nodded thoughtfully. "Your water retention levels are unlike anything we've measured nearby." Helen looked toward the hills beyond her property. Most of the surrounding fields had begun turning pale under the growing drought. Yet patches of green still spread naturally across Samuel's restored landscape. The difference was no longer subtle. Even from the road, people could see it. Richard Doyle stood beside Arthur Collins, watching the inspectors finish their work. For several minutes he remained silent before finally speaking. "Years ago I filled several old swales on my north pasture because I wanted straighter fields." Arthur looked at him without judgment. Richard sighed. "Now I wonder how much water I threw away." Arthur rested both hands on his cane. "Most of us thought the old ways were mistakes." Richard nodded slowly. "Maybe they weren't old. Maybe they were simply forgotten." As evening approached, the lead inspector asked Helen if he could borrow Samuel Whitaker's notebook and the large hand-drawn map for a detailed comparison with county archives. Helen hesitated only long enough to wrap both carefully inside a clean cloth. "Please take good care of them," she said. "They're the reason we're standing here." "You have my word," the inspector replied. 2 days later, he returned carrying several copied records from the county agricultural office. Everyone gathered once again around Helen's kitchen table. Liam had driven in after work. Emma stood beside him while Arthur and Richard quietly took seats near the window. The inspector spread several yellow documents beside Samuel's map. "We found something remarkable," he began. The first file contained correspondence from nearly 35 years earlier. Samuel Whitaker had submitted a proposal describing natural water retention through contour swales, native grasses, orchards, and soil restoration, instead of relying only on larger irrigation systems. Helen recognized many of the same sketches that appeared in the notebook. "He tried to show them," she whispered. The inspector nodded. "He did." Another folder contained meeting notes from the County Agriculture Committee. Several members had dismissed Samuel's proposal as impractical and too slow to produce results. The project received no funding. Arthur lowered his head. "He told me they weren't ready to listen." Emma carefully turned another page. "But he kept building anyway." "Yes," the inspector answered, "using his own land as proof." Helen looked through the copied documents with growing admiration. Samuel had not abandoned his ideas after being rejected. He had quietly transformed every acre of his own property instead, trusting that one day the land itself would become the evidence. Richard removed his glasses and stared at the old records. "I remember people calling him stubborn." Arthur smiled faintly. He preferred patient. The inspector unfolded one final document recovered from county storage. It was a later report describing several successful soil conservation methods introduced throughout neighboring districts. Helen frowned. The diagrams looked strangely familiar. The curved water paths, the protected tree belts, the restored drainage lines. Emma compared the report with Samuel's original proposal. "These are almost identical." The inspector nodded gravely. "Many of the same principles appear here." Helen searched the pages for Samuel's name. It never appeared. Instead, another consultant had received official credit for introducing the approach years after Samuel's proposal had been rejected. Arthur quietly closed his eyes. He never complained. Richard looked toward the orchard outside the window. He just kept working. The room fell silent.
Samuel had spent decades proving an idea without asking for recognition. Helen suddenly understood why the notebook contained no bitterness. It had never been written to defend his reputation. It had been written to help the land survive.
Before leaving, the inspector handed Helen another copied memorandum discovered inside the archive.
"You should read this," he said. She unfolded the single page. It summarized a review of Samuel Whitaker's original proposal, completed shortly after his death. At the bottom, beneath several official signatures, one recommendation had been typed but never acted upon.
Original restoration model, worthy of future preservation. Helen looked slowly around the table. Arthur smiled through damp eyes. Emma rested a hand on Samuel's notebook. Richard quietly removed his cap. Outside, the restored orchard swayed gently in the warm breeze, while the surrounding valley waited for rain that still had not come. Inside the farmhouse, everyone understood the same truth. Samuel Whitaker had not failed. He had simply lived too far ahead of his time. The county's findings reached town before Helen had time to prepare herself for what they would mean. At the grocery store, people who had once smiled politely at her strange purchase now stopped beside her cart to ask about Samuel Whitaker's notebook. At the post office, farmers leaned close and wanted to know whether the old swales on their land might still be found. Even the woman at the diner who had once whispered that Helen had thrown her future away pressed a hand over Helen's and said, "I suppose that land knew something we didn't." Helen never knew how to answer except with a quiet smile. Nearly 1 year had passed since she had signed the papers for the abandoned 65 acres. The farmhouse no longer looked empty. The porch had been repaired. The windows opened easily, and the fields beyond it moved in layers of green instead of dust. The orchard bloomed against a dry summer that had left much of the valley struggling. People began driving by slowly, not to laugh anymore, but to look. On the anniversary of her purchase, the county agricultural office organized an open visit to the farm. Helen had expected a handful of officials and curious neighbors. By mid-morning, cars lined the gravel road from the main gate to the bend near Arthur's Hill. Families walked the paths Helen had mowed months earlier. Farmers stood beside restored swales with folded arms, studying the way the grass stayed green where water had been guided and held. Children ran toward the orchard until their parents gently reminded them not to disturb the young blossoms and bees. Liam stood beside Helen near the farmhouse, shaking his head in disbelief. "A year ago I was trying to talk you out of staying here." Helen smiled. "A year ago, I wasn't sure you were wrong." He looked across the crowd. "You were right to listen." Those words settled warmly in her chest. Arthur arrived slowly with his cane, wearing a clean shirt and his best hat. Helen walked to meet him before he reached the porch. "Samuel should be seeing this," she said. Arthur looked toward the orchard. "Maybe in some way, he is." The lead county inspector addressed the crowd beneath the oldest apple tree, with Samuel's map displayed on an easel beside him. He explained that the land's recovery was not a miracle in the magical sense, but the result of patient design, protected soil, restored water paths, deep roots, shaded ground, and the central orchard Samuel had called the Living Heart. Then he held up the copied archive record. "The county recognizes Samuel Whitaker as the original designer of this restoration model," he announced. "His proposal was dismissed in his lifetime, but the evidence on this farm proves its value today." Applause moved through the orchard like wind through leaves. Arthur lowered his head. Emma wiped her eyes. Helen looked at the map, remembering the day she had first found the small notebook in the attic, without understanding a single thing it truly meant.
Richard Doyle stepped forward after the official remarks. For a moment, he stood in front of the crowd without his usual confidence. "I owe Helen Brooks an apology," he said, "and I owe one to Samuel Whitaker, though I can't give it to him in person." The crowd grew quiet.
Richard looked toward Helen. "I laughed at this farm. I told people it was worthless. I thought land had value only if it produced quickly and cleanly." He glanced toward the green swales and the blooming orchard. "I was wrong." Helen nodded softly, accepting the apology without making him smaller. Richard continued, "I've already begun marking the old swales on my own property. Any farmer who wants help finding theirs can use my equipment." That offer changed the mood from admiration to action. All afternoon, neighbors walked the property with Emma, comparing Samuel's map to their own memories of old ditches, tree lines, and slopes their parents once protected. The restoration model began spreading beyond Helen's fence before the day had ended. Several farmers asked whether Helen would host workshops. Others wanted to bring students from the local school. The county proposed preserving Samuel's records and using the farm as a demonstration site for drought-resistant land recovery. Helen listened quietly, overwhelmed by how 1 year of stubborn patience had become something larger than herself. Near sunset, as the last visitors lingered beside the orchard, the county commissioner made one final announcement. "This property will be recognized as the Whitaker Living Land Preserve," he said, "in honor of the man who saw its future before anyone else did, and the woman who gave it 1 more year to speak." Helen felt Liam's hand close around hers. Emma smiled from beside the map. Arthur's eyes shone beneath the brim of his hat. The crowd applauded again, but Helen barely heard it. She was looking across the 65 acres. No longer abandoned, no longer mocked, no longer silent. The land had finally told the truth. And now the town was ready to give it a name. The naming ceremony took place 3 weeks later on a clear morning that carried the first cool hint of autumn. A simple wooden arch had been built near the entrance to the farm, where the old real estate sign had once leaned in the weeds. Helen stood beside it, looking across the same 65 acres that had frightened her the first time she drove down the overgrown lane. The fields were still imperfect. Some fences needed work. The barn still leaned slightly, and several sections of the farmhouse porch creaked beneath every step. But nothing about the land felt abandoned anymore. It breathed with quiet life. Green swales curved through the hills. The orchard held clusters of young fruit. Birds moved through hedgerows that Helen had almost cleared away before Samuel's notebook taught her better. People began arriving before the ceremony started. Farmers parked along the gravel road. Children carried notebooks for a school project. County officials set up a small table displaying copies of Samuel Whitaker's map, his handwritten proposal, and photographs of the land before Helen bought it. Arthur Collins arrived with Liam's help, moving slowly but smiling like a man who had waited years for this day. Emma Doyle stood near the orchard, answering questions from visitors about soil moisture, roots, shade, and water retention. Richard moved quietly among the crowd, greeting neighbors without the old certainty in his voice. He had already reopened 2 swales on his own farm and had brought equipment twice to help other landowners locate theirs. Liam stood beside Helen as the commissioner stepped forward. 1 year ago, the commissioner began, many people believed this farm was beyond saving. Today, we recognize it as the Whitaker Living Land Preserve, a place of learning, restoration, and public memory. The crowd turned toward the covered sign at the gate. Helen felt her throat tighten as Liam gently squeezed her hand. The commissioner continued,
Samuel Whitaker saw a future others dismissed. Helen Brooks had the patience to listen when the land finally spoke. When the cloth was pulled away, the new sign stood in dark, carved letters. Whitaker Living Land Preserve. Beneath it, smaller words had been added at Helen's request. The land was never dead. It was only waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Applause rose softly, then warmly, filling the open air. Helen looked at Arthur and saw tears on his cheeks. "He would have pretended not to care," Arthur whispered when she reached him. "But he would have cared." Helen smiled. "Then I hope we did it right." After the ceremony, visitors followed marked paths through the restored areas. Emma led a group of students to the orchard and explained how fallen leaves, flowering weeds, and deep roots work together. Richard showed farmers how to identify old swales on sloped fields. Arthur sat beneath the oldest apple tree and told stories about Samuel walking the property with a notebook in his pocket. Helen stayed near the farmhouse for a while, watching strangers learn from a man most of them had never met. The thought humbled her. She had come to the farm believing she needed a place to rebuild her own life. She had not known she was stepping into someone else's unfinished promise. Over the following months, the preserve became more than a sign at the gate. The county helped repair the barn and turn one section into a small learning center. Samuel's notebook and maps were preserved behind glass, with copies available for visitors. Emma began coordinating soil restoration workshops there on weekends. Farmers brought samples from their own land. School groups learned to read hillsides, tree lines, and rain paths the way Samuel once had. Helen never pretended to be an expert. When people praised her, she always pointed to the notebook. "I followed instructions," she would say. "The land did the rest." Liam, who had once begged her to move to the city, began spending more and more weekends at the farm. At first, he came to help repair fences and organize tools. Then he stayed to guide visitors, plant trees, and work beside his mother in the orchard. One evening, as they cleaned the old farmhouse kitchen after a workshop, he looked around the room and said, "I've been thinking about moving closer." Helen paused with a towel in her hands. "Are you sure?" Liam smiled. "I think this place still has work for both of us." Helen could only hug him. The divorce had taken a house from her, but this land had given back a home she had never expected. By the next spring, the valley looked different. Not everywhere, and not perfectly, but enough for people to notice. Old swales were reopened on neighboring farms. Hedgerows were protected instead of cleared. More fields held moisture after rain. During dry weeks, the preserve remained green longer than anyone thought possible. The change was not dramatic in a single day. It was steady, patient, and real. On the anniversary of the day she bought the farm, Helen walked alone to the hill overlooking all 65 acres. The orchard bloomed below her, soft white and pink against deep green. The farmhouse windows reflected the morning sun. The barn doors stood open, and inside, Emma was preparing another class. Liam was repairing a gate near the lower pasture. Arthur sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching everything with quiet satisfaction. Helen held Samuel's copied map in one hand and looked from its faded lines to the living land around her. A year earlier, people had called the farm worthless. They had laughed at her decision, questioned her judgment, and waited for her to fail. Now the same town sent their children here to learn patience from the soil. Helen folded the map carefully and placed it against her heart. She understood then that the miracle had never been that dead land came back to life overnight. The miracle was that someone had loved it enough to prepare it for a future he might never see. And someone else had arrived, broken enough to listen.
A breeze moved across the hillside, bending the grasses along the restored water paths. Helen smiled as the orchard shimmered below. The land had told the truth at last, and this time, the whole town had heard it.